Hi, I'm Karen Rice and welcome to my YouTube channel. In this tutorial, I'm going to be talking about how to use salt in watercolour painting, all the do's and don'ts, and I'm also going to do a little demonstration to show you how I use salt. So, shall we get started? These are some of the paintings that I've actually used salt with, and as you can see, it looks like lavender in the background. Salt sort of soaks the paint up and can create texture and light, and depending on the timing that you put it on, you can get bigger marks and smaller marks, or really big marks. I'll explain that later, but as you can see here in this painting here, it creates so much lovely texture. I was so pleased with this bluebell wood. It really made the painting. And again, in this wildflowers painting, it created distant wildflowers and texture and atmosphere as well. So I really hope this tutorial is going to really help you if you want to use salt in this way, the do's and the don'ts, the tips and techniques, and maybe this tutorial will inspire you to use salt in your paintings. Salt is all about the timing, so I'm going to sort of explain my process here. So I've painted a little wash of green and I've sprinkled some sea salt onto wet paint. So I'm going to let the salt soak up the paint, and meanwhile I'm going to paint another little strip which I'm going to use to put salt on when the paint becomes more damp, so there's still a sheen but it's not as wet as the one on the left. And now I'm painting another one here, and I'm going to let that really dry off and sprinkle the salt on. So my next 3 strips of paint I'm actually going to use table salt with, but there's lots of varieties of salt, so you could actually experiment maybe. So I'm just sprinkling some table salt onto some wet paint. I'm going to let that sort of develop. Now I'm sprinkling the sea salt onto the paint that's got a sheen on there, so it's damp, and I'm just putting my last bit of paint here just on the end, just found enough space, and I'm going to use that to put the salt on when it's dried off a bit. So I'm just sprinkling some table salt onto the surface here where it is damp. I've just used a little time lapse here just to show you how the salt is changing, especially on number 2 and number 5. Now I'm sprinkling some sea salt onto drying paper. It hasn't completely dried, but the sheen has actually gone from the paper. And I'm doing the same. I'm putting some table salt on the last one there that's nearly dried as well. So the paint has dried, and if we look at this on the first one, that's where I use the sea salt on wet paper. We've got some gorgeous effects. And then if you look at the next one where it was damp paint, they're not as sort of big, there's sort of less marks there, some smaller marks as well. And if we look at where there was no sheen, there are hardly any marks. And then when we take a look at the table salt put on the wet paper, I think the paper may have been even wetter, and that's why you've got those really big marks. And sometimes you don't want those sort of marks because it's a bit more out of control. And the next one with where I put the table salt onto the damp paper, you've got some gorgeous effects there. Comparing that with the one with the sea salt, the table salt creates some really lovely little wildflowers effects. So you can sort of try out these different salts. There's lots out there, and try them on different sort of wetness of paper, from sort of very wet to almost drying, to see what happens. Advice would be is to make sure the tonal value is at least a mid-tone, because sometimes when it's very light you can't see the sort of salt effect because there's not enough contrast. That's something to look out for. So I've really made sure my salt's absolutely dry before you remove it with kitchen towel, or you can move it with the bottom of a tube of paint. It gently removes very stubborn salt that's stuck to the paper. As you can see, where there was no sheen, I almost waited too long and the salt didn't really work very well. So I'm going to show you what you can do when that happens. So I'm using a wet brush and I'm reawaking the dried paint to get it moving again, really get that paint moving again, and then sprinkle your salt. I'm doing the same on the end here. I'm reawakening the paint, as it were. This is a little bit more stubborn. It's really dried on. It may have been I used a little bit more of the Prussian Blue, which is more staining, but I'm actually applying the table salt and I'm going to let that dry off a bit. See if the salt will work. And as you can see, it has in the middle, but it hasn't on the end. Salt's very unpredictable, and what I would advise is just practice with different colours, different timings, different salts, and different papers, it all makes a difference, rather than that expectation when you start to paint you can be disappointed. That's why watercolour is so much fun, because it's very unpredictable. I've got my little sketchbook here and I've actually masked out some little daisies, but as you can see on the left there, I've done a little bit of experimenting. So, you know, have a go at doing something like that when your sketchbook's ideal. What I'm doing now is I'm just putting some background colours on, wet into wet, on top of my sort of daisies. The masking fluid has dried, do make sure it's dried. I'm just sloshing on these colours. I'm making it a little bit dark at the bottom and lighter at the top, so it looks like the light of the sky, and just have fun with it. I'm using sap green, Prussian blue, cadmium yellow, touch of red in there as well, just throwing the paint on. I'm actually using my Twig now. I've dipped it into the sap green. I'm just drawing in some thin sort of stem and just a little bit of texture. And just beware when you're using a sketchbook, try not to do too much wet in wet, and don't scratch too hard with the twigs, because you could actually tear the paper because it's usually thinner. So I'm just using now my size 6 brush, putting on some creamier, darker paint, the green and the Prussian blue, and just putting this on damp into damp just to create a little bit of detail. So I'm starting off now, I'm sprinkling some sea salt at the top, and the paint is wet, and I'm going to use a little bit of table salt in the middle area where the paint is wet as well. I'm just experimenting, and I'm sprinkling the table salt and sea salt at the bottom of the painting just to see what happens, and just let that dry off. And here it is, it's dried, and isn't it wonderful, the lovely marks at the top? It looks like little wild flowers, and as you can see, as the paint dried off, the marks get a little bit smaller. So as it's thoroughly dry, I'm brushing it off with my kitchen towel just to get those little bits of salt off, and using the end of my paintbrush very gently to remove any sort of residue salt. I'm removing my framing tape just to say it was a bit too soon to remove this, because I'm going to be doing spattering later, so don't remove your tape just yet. But I'm just carefully removing it, and now I'm taking off my masking fluid. Again, make sure your painting is completely dry before you do this, and I'm using my framing tape, or you can use your thumb or a rubber to remove the masking fluid. So now I'm just mixing up some yellow and red to make some orange centres for these little daisies. So as you can see there, I just put some leaves in there with my size 6 brush, just using the greens in my palette. I've watered down some cobalt blue here, and I'm just painting some shadows on the petals, very dilute, just to give a little bit of detail. Remember, this is just in your sketchbook, you're just having a little practice. Don't put any pressure on yourself, just have fun with it. Less is more, and don't paint too many shadows on those white flowers, because they'll end up looking grey. I'm just putting a little bit of dark sort of just underneath the centres here to create a little bit of shadow, just to really pop those centres out. I'm also using a little bit of the cadmium yellow just on top of this orange here, just to put a little bit of highlight in the middle of the daisies. I'm just finishing off now with a little spatter. As you can see, I shouldn't have removed my framing tape, and I'm using orange and yellows and dark greens just to really give that little bit of fine bit of texture. I do love a little spatter. Try not to put too much spattering over your lovely salt though. I'm putting a few more little blades of grass and leaves in there just at the bottom where it's darkest, and I've just thought I'd paint in some of my stems and the back of some of the daisies just with a medium green, a sap green, a little bit of Prussian blue, maybe a touch of burnt sienna in there as well to warm up the green, just little flicks here and there. Now if you have sort of spattered over some of your white, wait for it to dry up, wait for your painting to dry off, and you can actually put some white gouache or watercolour paint over the top just to rescue them. And I thought I might as well give that a little spatter as well, why not? Here's a close-up of the little painting here, and I'm really pleased with it just because the texture is fabulous. I think I'll leave it there for now. I really hope this tutorial has helped you answer your questions about salt. And if you have any more questions about salt or anything else in this tutorial, please put them in the comments section below. I would love to hear from you. If you'd like to see see more tutorials like this, why not subscribe to my YouTube channel and you'll get updates of my latest videos. Thanks again for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.